If you ride off the beaten path, you may eventually come upon a tree or branch across the road. If it's too high to ride over, or there isn't enough space to go around, you either need to turn around or do some trail maintenance, as has been done by others on this trail. This means having some sort of saw or hatchet on the bike. When packing a motorcycle, I like to minimize weight and bulk so it helps when tools can perform multiple functions, like the tire irons that are also a bead breaker or an axle tool. A couple years ago, I saw a YouTube video by Knife Point Gear about a super light backpacking saw that was made from a carbon fiber tube and a reciprocating saw blade. I realized that I was already carrying an aluminum tube in my trail jack. It turned out to be just the right size, and I only had to make a few simple modifications to it. Here's a quick demo of the jack being used for its intended purpose. I keep the jack attached to the luggage rack using some Velcro straps. They have held the jack securely for 15,000 miles so far. When lifting the rear off the ground, I always lock the front brake with one of the Velcro straps, and turning the bars to the left makes it more secure as well. You could even use the steering lock to make sure it doesn't turn. I use the foot peg bracket as the support point to get the rear tire off the ground. I set the length of the jack to be a couple inches longer than the peg to ground distance. I lift the rear tire off of the ground by holding the passenger peg and pushing my butt into the side of the seat. I only get the tire about an inch off of the ground, which makes dealing with the wheel and tire easier for me. For the front tire, I make sure the bike is in first gear and I set the jack to its longest length. I use a hole in the front of the skid plate that will just keep the front tire off the ground. I push on the handlebars to lift the front tire. I always wiggle the bike to make sure that the jack is secure. I got this jack years ago from a small shop on a forum. To make it work as a saw handle, I drilled a 1/2-inch hole in the foot of the jack and filed a groove in both ends to keep the saw blade and tensioner from rotating. I put a 1/8-inch cotter pin through the hole in a reciprocating saw blade and bent it into a W shape. I use a 7/64-inch Dyneema cord to tension the blade. Dyneema is very strong and does not stretch a lot. I joined the ends together using a Zeppelin bend. I have 2 carbide tooth blades to try out. The one on top has 3 teeth per inch, which is more aggressive than the 5 teeth per inch blade below. I keep the blades in a bit of plastic irrigation tubing under the seat of the bike, where they're out of the way, but easy to get to when needed. Also living under there is a clutch and throttle cable repair kit, a multi-tool, and an extra tube. To assemble the saw, take the jack apart. And take the blades out of the sheath. It's not a bad idea to store the clip on the blade sheath to keep from losing it. Now feed the tensioning rope through the jack, making sure the blade is seated in its slot. Now put the top of the jack through the loop in the rope and twist until the blade is fully tensioned. And there you have it, a saw made using parts I was already bringing with me. Let's see how the aggressive blade does against a 7-inch hardwood log. The saw will occasionally grab the wood, but it does a good job removing material quickly. You can see how much sawdust is coming out of the cut. It is nice to have two different ways of holding the saw depending on the position of the log. It feels a little less tiring being able to change your grip. Not quite there. Just under 4 minutes to get through a decent-sized log. Here's a 5-inch log with the 5 TPI blade on the left and 3 TPI on the right. The finer blade doesn't seem to catch in the log as often and takes less force to use. However, it doesn't remove material as quickly. You can see how much more sawdust is coming out of the cut on the right. The coarse blade makes it through a lot faster. The finer blade takes nearly twice as long. Let's see how they do on a 2-inch branch. On smaller branches, the coarse blade tends to grab the wood much more often, especially when getting started. This size seems pretty ideal for campfire wood. It cuts quickly and doesn't really need to be split. You know what they say about firewood? It warms you up twice. When you cut it and when you burn it. The finer pitch blade is only a few seconds slower on smaller branches and took less effort to use. These carbide tooth reciprocating saw blades seem pretty well suited for hand use and can be found at most hardware stores. Unfortunately, it doesn't look like my trail jack is still being sold, but I've found a couple alternatives. The Rolling Mavericks Ultralight Enduro Trail Jack stand, that's a mouthful, has an inner diameter large enough to accommodate a saw blade, but it may need a shim to hold the blade tightly. I have no affiliation with them, but it looks like a nicely made tool. If you are looking to duplicate this saw without the jack component, you just need an aluminum tube with a 1/2 or 13mm inner diameter. The tube here has an ID of 13mm and OD of 16mm. I filed 2 small notches to make the blade sit flush with the end of the tube and filed down any sharp edges. I used a small piece of cherry that came from the yard to make a tensioner, and I filed notches in it to keep the rope from rubbing the edge of the tube. The wood does a good job keeping the tension. I'm happy with this saw setup, and I'm looking forward to using it on upcoming motocamping trips. If you're still here, thanks for watching.